Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Is welcome you once again to Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi, where we touch on a whole host of issues, global and local. Now, for the first hour, we will be touching on the whole question surrounding the controversy on the UK government on arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Now, there is a concerted campaign against the arms trade because these weapons have been exported and they have contributed to thousands of deaths in Yemen, innocent civilians. And we've seen the entire conflict in Yemen as it had unfolded, Saudi Arabia in particular leading this campaign in Yemen. And we've seen the death, the destruction, the desperation. We've seen what it's done to a country like Yemen. It has basically destroyed an entire country where large sections of the population, close on to 80% of the population, are living in abject poverty, and also at the same time looking at the billions in the arms trade and the arms deals that have been struck not only by the United Kingdom but other countries around the world, countries like France. We're looking at the United States of America. And it is clear that the matter has gone to court in Britain and calling for these exports to be unlawful because these are crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity that have been committed. And we've seen the UK government temporarily halting the sales following the ruling of the court. But latest developments we see, in fact, I've just heard, and I'm sure my guest tonight, Emily Apple, who is the media coordinator of the campaign against the arms trade, and we've got Niku Jafarnia, who is with the Yemen and Bahrain research against human rights. So tonight we will be unpacking this discussion, and hopefully a lot of light will be shed on this entire debacle surrounding the arms sales by the United Kingdom to a country like Saudi Arabia. And time to welcome both our guests this evening, and we're going to get them on screen very, very shortly. We're going to get, I see Niku Jafarnia coming on, Niku and Emily Apple as well. Niku, welcome to the show. Wonderful you're able to join us, and we do appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Very grateful to have the chance to speak with you tonight.
Yes, and also Emily Apple, thank you for your time. We do appreciate it.
Oh, yes, and thank you for having me as well. It's again appreciated.
Yes. Now, Nico, just to begin with and to put this entire discussion into context, now I painted a brief picture in my introduction, and for the very reasons, the whole subject surrounding arms sales by the United Kingdom to Saudi Arabia is a hot potato. It's a massive subject, and it's of massive interest considering where a country like Yemen is, a country that has been on the receiving end of Saudi aggression for a long, long time.
Yeah, so to give a bit of background, Saudi Arabia entered the Yemeni war in 2015. And since then, they're the only party that does airstrikes, that conducts airstrikes, which is why it's really easy to attribute airstrikes to them specifically. But since 2015, so over the last 8 years, the Saudi-led coalition has conducted over 25,000 airstrikes in Yemen, which is completely unbelievable. It's an unfathomable number to me. And the UK has a fairly large role to be played in this. It's actually my colleague at CAT, I'm sure, at the Campaign Against Arms Trade can speak to this more, but the Campaign Against Arms Trade has recorded over $23 billion, or 23 billion pounds, sorry, in arms sales to Saudi since the war began and since they entered the war. And so this, the impact of this has been massive. There's been over 20,000 civilian casualties, and those are just what's documented, and just from airstrikes alone. And so, the impact has been untold, not to mention the humanitarian catastrophe that exists in the country right now with, about 70% of the country in need of humanitarian aid. I can go on and on, but I'll pause there for now.
Well, thank you for that, Niku. And let's just bring Emily into the discussion. Now, Emily, as Niku has mentioned, 25,000 airstrikes, thousands upon thousands of people that have been affected, millions in abject poverty, starvation, disease, all of that put together. And for a long time, we know the powers that be, those, particularly those who have been doing business with Saudi Arabia, the arms trade with Saudi Arabia, they've been turning a blind eye to all these atrocities that have taken place and the genocide that has unfolded.
Yes, it's been very clear that, I mean, certainly in terms of the UK government, that they've put profit of arms dealers over the lives of the Yemeni people. And yes, as we were just saying, there's been over £23 billion worth of arms sales to the Saudi regime since conflict began in Yemen. And this has included things like Typhoon aircrafts. It's included paveway bombs. And, you know, there's clear evidence that these weapons have been used in war crimes, in violation of international humanitarian law. And so that's why we as Campaign Against the Arms Trade have been taking the government to court this week to try and stop these sales. Now, we won our first case. We've already been here. We took the government to court before. And that case found that the government wasn't even reviewing whether there were breaches of international humanitarian law when they were authorizing these sales. So the original court case found that these sales were illegal because they were irrational. And so because they were irrational in terms of the decision making, they were unlawful. However, the government then reviewed the sales and they decided, and they found a loophole to say that these breaches were isolated incidents. And so they resumed sales again. So our court case now is about trying to show that these aren't isolated incidents. We've got overwhelming evidence that there's been multiple breaches of international humanitarian law, there's been war crimes committed, and that these weapons should not be sold. And it's very, very telling that time and again, it is about profit rather than people's lives, rather than looking at what's happening on the ground, and that the government would rather contribute to one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters than it would stop these sales.
Yes, thank you for that, Emily, and just bringing Niku back into the discussion. Now, Niku, as a researcher, I'm certain that you've done extensive research into this particular subject that we are talking about, and also looking at the evidence in your research. And I'm sure there's a lot of evidence that you've gathered, you know, both in terms of the violations of the war crimes that have been committed, and also evidence in law that suggests that these arms sales to Saudi Arabia have been illegal in every way whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think at the end of the day, it's not even complicated to really explain how obvious and overwhelming the evidence is that the Saudi coalition has been committing just endless violations of international humanitarian law, and that these weapons are contributing to it. It's not really a case where, you know, there's been a few airstrikes, which in itself is problematic, but I mean, you're unclear whether they were targeting military targets, whether they were targeting civilian targets. In this case, you're looking at legitimately, and this is just what's documented, 20,000 civilian deaths over the span of an 8-year conflict, and 7 years of which, you know, the Saudi coalition has been involved. And that's a massive amount. And to have, you know, consistent airstrikes, not just singular one-off incidents against hospitals, against schools, against other healthcare facilities, against water infrastructure. You know, I could again go on and on about this, but it's endless evidence to the fact that they are specifically have carried out like thousands of strikes on specifically civilian infrastructure and civilians. which is, the largest law under international humanitarian law, is that you can't, target civilians. That's what a lot of the laws are really based off of, is this, idea that you need to be protecting civilians in conflict. And they're absolutely not doing that. And to consider, to make a claim that it's isolated incidents when there's just troves of evidence that's contrary to that is, absurd, to put it bluntly.
Yes, thank you for that, Niku. And just getting back to Emily and the whole question surrounding protecting civilians during a conflict situation. And what Niku has alluded to is when one looks at Saudi Arabia and the coalition that supported Saudi Arabia during this 8-year conflict acted with total impunity. And the people of Yemen have been left at the mercy of some of the most brutal forms of bombardment, considering that a lot of it were cowardly. From the air, these people were helpless. They've had absolutely no protection whatsoever. And this is the reason, Emily, why this is absolutely important. This is so critical for us to be having this discussion tonight.
Definitely. And I think absurd is exactly the word, that our lawyer used in court to describe the government's reasoning on this. It is just so disgusting that these sales are going ahead when there have been so many violations. And it's very telling. We've been listening to the government's evidence today, and they say things like this, the level of civilian deaths and injuries, it's what we should be expecting in a conflict of this nature. And that is just such horrific logic and horrific reasoning to justify selling arms that are being used in this way. The government's also been very dismissive of, for example, UN committees on Yemen that are specialists that are set up to investigate incidents of this nature. And the government lawyers were trying to cast doubt on the findings of the UN, and saying that even when the UN's found that there's been breaches of IHL, if the Saudis haven't responded to particular allegations, then they're not being counted by the UK government as plausible breaches of IHL. And so we're in the most absurd situation in terms of the government's logic and the government's justification for resuming these arms sales. And it's the people of Yemen that are suffering. It's the people of Yemen who've had to deal with so many years of this bombardment. And it's one of the reasons why Campaign Against Arms Trade have been taking this case. It's been in solidarity with the Yemeni people and being able to use the position that we've got to be able to challenge these arms sales and to hopefully bring an end to them. And I think whatever the court decides and whichever way that comes down is in some ways, obviously we're hoping to win, but the moral arguments and the legal arguments in terms of international humanitarian law are still there, and these sales shouldn't be taking place. The government can choose to stop these arms sales. They don't have to keep on doing them, regardless of what their findings are. They can take a moral stance on it, and they are choosing not to, and that is disgusting.
Yes, Emily, and also Niku, it's not only about the sale of arms, it is about who you are selling arms to. And especially a country like Saudi Arabia that have been complicit in many a crime. If we go back and look at the invasion of Iraq, Saudi Arabia was complicit by making their bases available to the coalition. And at that point in time, we know what has happened in Iraq, more than 1 million people that were killed in Iraq. So this is a country that has been complicit in war crimes in more ways than one. And that is why I'm raising this question. It's not about the sale of arms. It is about who you are selling arms to, because this is a country, and coming from your background in terms of human rights research, We know that there are untold violations that are being committed by Saudi Arabia, both internally and when they participate in these type of war crimes, invading a country like Yemen, and also being a coalition to many other atrocities that have been committed.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's difficult to say that arms sales to any country could really end well, because arms are generally used in conflicts that end up killing civilians. Overall, I think the arms sales internationally are highly riddled with problems, to say the absolute least. But beyond that, yes, of course, Saudi Arabia is a country that is involved in countless conflicts, and in each one of them, they've committed serious violations of IHL, again, to say the least. And I think the UK, and many other countries, it's not just the UK, but they've chosen to turn a blind eye to these because of the money behind it. And that really is what it comes down to, is that, their financial incentives are greater for them than the human cost of this. The fact that, as Emily was just saying, that they've made these callous statements in court about this is, a normal cost of a conflict. Like, I don't understand what that means, a normal cost of a conflict. At the end of the day, each life should not, cannot be just taken as like a singular number, or just thought of as a typical casualty of war. It is a life that's been ended because of the sale of weapons and the financial interests that are involved in this conflict. And it didn't need to be that way. And the UK absolutely could, at the very least, benefit the conflict by pulling out their arms sales. There's no denying that. I mean, there's specific cases that we found in which, different organizations, particularly Muwatana for Human Rights, which is a Yemeni civil society organization, they've done such a good job of documenting, countless airstrikes to begin with, and countless violations of IHL by all warring parties. But specifically, they have found remnants of UK weapons used in airstrikes that have ultimately killed civilians. And so, regardless of even the higher level, taking out the, the UK could argue that there's levels, there's layers. They're selling the arms. They don't know what's happening with the arms. I, again, would call that a bit absurd, because where the arms are. But beyond that, oh, sorry, did my internet cut out?
It's okay. Go ahead, Niku.
Beyond that, I just think, like, when you're seeing actual weapons remnants from UK weapons in airstrikes that have actually caused civilian harm, there's no denying the fact that obviously these sales are contributing to civilian harm, and that these are not isolated incidents. It's happened again and again and again. And ultimately that's against their own law, like, beyond my own moral arguments and international law arguments, whatever you want to call it. Like, there's a lot of reasons why they shouldn't be doing this, but it's against their own domestic law to be selling arms in a situation like this.
Yes, and also, Emily, we've heard often about the military-industrial complex and the power of the military-industrial complex, and how they operate, and the influence that they have actually on governments, particularly when it comes to sales. And again, the question that I had raised with Niku with regard to Saudi Arabia being complicit, and perhaps a comment from you as well, looking at countries like Saudi Arabia, a pariah state in every sense of the word.
Absolutely, and it is this, like in the UK, there's a revolving door between Parliament and arms companies. You have MPs who are on the board of arms companies, or leave politics and go and work for arms companies. So there's a huge vested interest from the sort of political elite to keep these sales going. Again, we have these priority markets of human rights abusing states that the UK government is desperate to sell arms to. And that's why it's so important that we find whatever these pressure points are that we can find, like this judicial review that we've taken now, to put that pressure on the government and to let them know that these decisions are going to be scrutinized as well. Because for example, when they've reviewed these incidents that they're saying are isolated incidents, again, they're sort of hoping that they can just sort of say, oh, we've reviewed them now. That's all right. It's business as usual. And so it's why it's important that we're back in court and letting them know that every time they do something like this, we are going to be scrutinizing those decisions. We are going to be challenging those decisions, because ultimately it's, people's lives, not just in Yemen, but around the world, that are being devastated by these weapons. And we have to do something about it. We can't just sort of sit by and go, oh, well, this is economically viable. This is how the UK makes money. Well, no, that's not good enough. So we do have a lot of work to also dismantle this military industrial complex and to expose these links and to show why this isn't something that we should have and that we should support, and to do something about it.
Yes, Emily. And also, Niku, from what Emily describes, she speaks about a priority market. And it does appear that the military industrial complex and governments like the UK target countries that are most likely to commit aggression, that are most likely to commit brutality, that are most likely to commit genocide, as we have seen in the case of Saudi Arabia and Yemen.
I wish that I feel like Emily is the better placed person to be speaking to this, because I don't know enough about the different countries that the UK is selling their arms to and their exact human rights records. What I will say is that oftentimes they're selling them to countries that want to be using them. And they're, countries that want arms usually are going in and causing untold violations of human rights law and international humanitarian law in different countries around the world, and causing civilian harm at the end of the day. And those are often very wealthy countries that can A, afford it to begin with, and B, have an interest in buying these weapons and using them somewhere. So I'll leave it to Emily to say more on that in case I'm.
Well, Emily, I see Niku has passed the buck onto you to answer that question.
So in terms of priority markets, so for example, Qatar's a priority market for the UK. That obviously has a horrendous human rights record. Turkey, again, is a priority market for the UK, and we've seen evidence of horrendous chemical attacks by Turkish forces in Syria recently. Erdogan's aggression across Turkey's borders is massive, and the human rights record within Turkey's own borders is also obscene. And again, it's all these places where we're fueling conflicts and creating refugees, creating displacement, creating economic problems, let alone the loss of civilian lives and just the destruction of infrastructure and the destruction of people's lives. But in the UK, it's very much the priority is selling weapons. And so because we want to sell these weapons and because the country wants to make this money from the weapons, the government isn't asking those difficult questions. And that was clear in some of the evidence that came out today in the High Court when talking about Saudi. And in the cases where the UK government has said, well, we really need a response from Saudi Arabia to investigate whether there's been a breach of IHL, they actually said, well, there can be diplomatic and political reasons for not asking those questions of the Saudi regime. So we're in a situation where the government's openly admitting that it's not asking difficult questions because it wants to preserve its relationship with Saudi Arabia. And again, it's hard to see how anyone can justify that, other than the fact that it's about economic interests and about fueling the arms trade at the cost of lives.
Emily, I'd just like to touch a bit more on detail on the matter that has gone to court. And I'm sure, you've had compelling arguments, particularly particularly looking at it from a human rights perspective and looking at the immorality of this conflict in Yemen, and also at the same time the immorality of the arms trade of the UK government. But in their defense, in the UK government's defense, has anything come out in court? What is the UK government saying?
The UK government is basically being very dismissive of the claims of IHL breaches. It's saying, as I said, that they're isolated incidents. They're saying that, well, you know, some bad things have happened in the past, but there's been learning from that, and the incidents have decreased because there's been learning, because the UK has been training Saudi forces, because the UK has this close relationship with Saudi. So it's ignoring so much of the evidence, and it's also choosing to ignore the evidence from Montana. It's ignoring evidence from the UN. It's ignoring evidence from Human Rights Watch and other organizations, and saying that their analysis isn't good enough, that only the UK government's analysis and only the Saudi government's analysis is sufficient in categorizing breaches of international humanitarian law. So that their arguments are very flimsy, and it comes down to whether a rational approach has been taken to reviewing these sales. So in terms of the narrow legal terms that we have to fight the case on, so that there's the wider sort of morality and even sort of international lawful arguments. But in terms of what the court is deciding, it's around whether this review that was conducted of arms sales and breaches of IHL was sufficient. And what the UK government has said is there's over half the cases that have been picked up as potential breaches of IHL haven't even been investigated because there isn't enough intelligence to do so. So they're just discounting them. So we're sort of challenging that blanket approach and sort of saying, well, actually, you need to consider these. You need to look at some of this other evidence. You can't just blanketly dismiss, for example, evidence from the UN. You can't just dismiss the evidence from human rights organizations on the ground. You've got to take that into consideration when reviewing arms sales and these breaches. But their government seem to be saying, well, in a conflict of this nature, we expect breaches of IHL, so that's okay. And that's frankly just not good enough.
Well, it certainly is not good enough, Emily. And also, Niku, when Emily speaks about the justification on the part of the British government, talking about isolated incidents. Now, we're talking about 8 years. We're talking about 8 long, hard years, 8 years where an entire country has been destroyed. And this argument of an isolated incident is actually laughable.
It absolutely is laughable. And I'll say it again, it's absurd and it's baseless. At the end of the day, the UK government, the laws that they're working with right now specifically say that governments should not license arms exports where there's a clear risk that the weapons might be used in serious violations of international humanitarian law, just a serious risk. And that requires actually going, of course, and looking at, how many past violations has a country committed in their use of these weapons. And so for them to just be dismissing all of these claims, but then also admitting that in fact, 20,000 people, 20,000 civilians, that's not even to say people, there's been many more people that have died in this, have died from airstrikes specifically. And then to say that, the evidence isn't strong enough to point to the fact that these are violations of IHL, even if you're not going to look at every single one of these airstrikes and deem them a violation of IHL, you have to admit to the fact that it is truly impossible to commit, 20,000 cases of civilian harm without having violated international humanitarian law. That's, at the least, you're talking about negligence, and you're talking about not taking proper precautions and proper distinction when it comes to finding civilians and ensuring that they're protected and not being targeted, et cetera. And so again, like there's plenty of evidence, which Emily has talked about as well. There's plenty of evidence, including by the UN, to demonstrate that there are, in fact, many violations of international humanitarian law where you are looking at specific airstrikes. There's been so much analysis done on this. And for them, if they want to dismiss half of the claims, you know, fine. Like, even if you're dismissing half of them, there's still too many claims to the fact that there are IHL violations regardless. And beyond that, there's also so many civilian deaths that even if you're not looking at each individual incident and each individual IHL violation of, again, which there are numerous, it's impossible to make the claim that in fact they're just isolated incidents and that there's not enough evidence. You know, when you look at the number of hospitals that have been attacked, there's entire reports that have been written on just the number of hospitals that have been attacked by airstrikes, on just the number of schools that have been attacked by airstrikes, on just water and food infrastructure that have been attacked by airstrikes. I mean, you have to be, they're a country with a large amount of military power and a lot of money and a lot of very, you know, high-end weapons, to say the least. And so they have the capabilities to not be targeting schools and hospitals and civilians, broadly speaking. That's there. It's not like they don't know what they're doing or they don't have the capacity, et cetera. And even so, of course, you still have the obligation. But, you know, there's really, I don't see how they could possibly be making the claim that these are isolated incidents and they don't have the ability to know about it. And beyond that, I think what Emily was saying about what they brought up in court about not wanting to hurt their relations and having this diplomatic relationship with them, I think that in itself is, they themselves are bringing up evidence against themselves. Like, that's not part of the equation when it comes to whether or not you're allowed to sell arms to a country. That's not part of the analysis. And whether they're, you know, how risky it is, how large the risk is that they're going to commit a serious violation of IHL. There's not a clause in there with an asterisk that says, well, like, it's actually okay if you know, you need to maintain a diplomatic relationship. It just doesn't work that way. And so I don't see the value of them bringing that into the discussion other than to prove what we all know, that of course that's why they're doing it, and that's just illegal at the end of the day.
Well, it certainly is. And also, Emily, we are not talking about a shipment of guns that Saudi Arabia, that have been sent to Saudi Arabia or sold to Saudi Arabia. We are talking about high-tech weaponry. We are talking about guided missiles. We are talking about guided bombs. And these are devastating in themselves. So there, again, you know, there is a compelling case that these are sophisticated weapons that have been sold to Saudi Arabia.
Oh, definitely. Because the majority of the conflict is through airstrikes. They're the weapons that are being provided. It's Typhoon and Tornado aircraft. It's things like the paveway bombs. And there is evidence, I think, as we touched on before, of fragments of these bombs that have been made and manufactured by UK companies being found on the ground in atrocities in Yemen. So there's a very, very clear and provable link between these arms sales and the deaths of civilians and the atrocities that are being committed. That there's no way to justify that. It is very, very clear. And what the situation is now, so the court case runs until tomorrow, but what we have now is a situation where the rest of the evidence is closed. So we don't get to hear it. Our lawyers don't get to hear it. We have to appoint special advocates to argue who've got security clearance. And so the information regarding the intelligence that they have on specific incidents isn't now all held in closed sessions. So there's a complete lack of transparency in terms of the actual mechanics of how they're assessing these incidents. So we have the sort of broad strokes of an overall picture, but those actual details are evidence that we're not even going to be able to hear. But in a sense, that doesn't matter because we know the evidence that's been collected on the ground. We know how many civilians have been killed. We know that there's been attacks on hospitals, on funerals, on water treatment plants, on key infrastructure. We know that it's not only the impact of these individual strikes, but the cumulative effect that's led to millions of people facing famine, that's caused so much misery and devastation for thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And that has to be viewed in its entirety. So when we're talking about isolated incidents and what the government says about sort of proving patterns, that has to be seen in its entirety of the situation that's been created by the use of these weapons, as well as the huge amount of evidence of individual strikes and the sort of armaments used in those strikes that we can prove were from UK weapons.
Yes, and also, Nico, when one looks at the hypocrisy of these deals between the UK government and Saudi Arabia, looking at what is playing out with Russia and Ukraine at this point in time, and how the entire world, including the United Kingdom, have rallied behind Ukraine and terming Russian aggression, looking at the casualties, the support that they have provided to the refugees, those that have been affected, those that have been fleeing the country, being accommodated in all parts around Europe and the world. And this hypocrisy is blatant. It is open for an entire world to see. Yet, when one looks at the Yemeni people, considering they were basically sitting ducks throughout 8 years, nowhere to go, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no one to support them.
Absolutely. I mean, there's not even much to say on that. I think we're all fully aware of the hypocrisy that's been fully present since the very beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. And that's not to say, that obviously civilian lives in Ukraine matter, and I hope that every conflict in the world from here on out receives the same amount of attention that it did, that refugees fleeing the country receive the same warm welcome that many refugees faced when they fled Ukraine. I hope everyone, if they ever have to suffer through such a fate of having their country invaded by other forces, by aggressive forces, receive the same welcome and receive the same kind of attention and scrutiny on Russia's war crimes and IHL violations as we've been seeing in the situation in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. But it was heartbreaking for so many people around the world that are conflict affected, in Yemen and in so many countries, to watch just the absolute attention that went into this, and to watch all these countries and governments, including the UK, of course, which you brought up, to be criticizing Russia and to be talking about this war as though, this one country has been so aggressive and they're causing all these things, when they're doing the exact same things in so many countries around the world and have blatantly made comments through this assessment and through their media commentary and analysis from the beginning of the war in Ukraine that demonstrate without any question that they clearly value the lives of Ukrainians and of people in Europe more than they value the lives of the many other people in the world that are living in conflict affected areas. I think it's just been blatantly obvious. And personally, I'm based in Beirut right now, where many of the Middle East correspondents are usually based, and all of them have been sent to Ukraine over the last year, meaning that they're not covering what's happening in the Middle East because their news agencies know, and it's valid and it's true that the world is paying attention, and the world with money and power is paying attention to the war in Ukraine, and people are tired of hearing things about the conflicts that are happening in the Middle East region and in other, and that the same is true for sub-Saharan Africa as well, and North Africa as well, and so there just has not been enough attention. There haven't been resources. I think with Yemen in particular, more than so many other places, not to just keep comparing. At the end of the day, every conflict has has untold amounts of civilian harm, and each one of them should be receiving resources and scrutiny and anything you can be doing for a country that's in conflict and for civilians in conflict. However, Yemen from the start has been given so little attention, so little media attention, so little resources. It's been continuously deemed as the forgotten war. It's also continuously been deemed as one of the worst humanitarian crises on earth. And yet people are not paying attention to what's happening there. And I think these days, when you bring up to people what's been happening in the conflict, there's often this response of, well, things are fine now. Like, there's not something very drastic happening. And that's just not true at all. It's just that people have gotten used to, including the UK government, they've completely gotten used to and have accepted the amount of civilian harm that has come out of this conflict, saying that it's normal when 20,000 civilian deaths or civilian casualties, which means deaths and injuries, just to be clear, from just airstrikes alone is not a negligible number. That is a massive number. And you don't see that just in every day. I can't even imagine that occurring in the UK. And I'm sure all of these government officials would never imagine something like that happening right now there. And to say it about another country that they are just blindly sending weapons off to, but have no attention to the people there and no attention to the humanitarian crisis there is just despicable. And I wish that at the very least, the Ukraine crisis and the war, I don't mean to keep calling it just a crisis, there's a war happening there. I, at the very least, hope that it would shed light on this hypocrisy and for countries to take a moment to reflect on the fact that they have been doing the same exact thing to many other countries around the world for many years now, and to think about how awful that is that they've been contributing to this directly. And my hope is that the UK will somehow not only recognize this, but come to stop selling weapons and being involved in this war and the other wars that they're also contributing to.
Yes, and also, Emily, you mentioned that now that you've reached a stage where there is a cloud of secrecy, there is no transparency. Are you concerned that a lot may remain hidden?
I think so. Yes, I think the whole arms industry is surrounded in secrecy, and the fact that we can't publicly scrutinize what's happening in detail is incredibly worrying. I mean, I know that the special advocates that are representing us are very good. They will do a very good job of that. But there's a wider point in terms of civil society, in terms of the people of Yemen, who deserve to know what basis the UK government has decided is okay to sell these weapons that are destroying their lives. And it's very difficult to be able to make specific arguments over, for example, what intelligence was used to say this was a breach of IHL and this wasn't, when we don't see that evidence. However, as I was saying before, there is so much overwhelming evidence that we do have and that we do have access to, that we know that the UK government is manipulating how they're viewing these incidents to be able to sell weapons. They're going for the lowest common denominator in being able to say, oh, well, this isn't a breach, so we don't have to worry about that. And I think, just to pick up on what Niku was saying, it's just this blatant hypocrisy of a government that thinks it can just pick and choose when it cares about human rights. And I would love it if the situation in Ukraine did mean that the government starts sort of going, well, this is the standard on which we judge breaches of IHL and war crimes, and we apply this across the board. But the reality is sadly very different. But it is so staggering. And what's staggering as well is, certainly sort of the mainstream media in this country, a lot of the time will pick up on what's happening in Ukraine. They'll pick up on the refugee situation and report it sympathetically. but they won't do that about other conflicts and other refugees and people who are fleeing because of UK bombs. There are so many people trying to get to the UK, thinking it's going to be a place of sanctuary, who are escaping bombs that we have made and sold for profit. And it is absolutely disgusting. And all of this should be sort of part of the analysis of how we're looking at the situation.
Exactly, Emily. And Niku, what is also disgusting is there's been almost no accountability on the civilian harm that has been caused in Yemen throughout this entire conflict. And as Emily alluded to, the mainstream media not even talking about it, not even touching it. And this is where it's left to human rights organizations, it's left to civil society, it's left to alternative media, like ours, for instance, to actually take the story up and to publicize it. So the world, is aware of what is taking place, and at the same time, getting civil society and human rights organizations to hold these governments and these arms companies accountable.
Absolutely. There's been an extreme dearth. There's not strong enough words to use about the lack of accountability in Yemen. The fact that the UK government has alluded to the fact that the evidence isn't strong enough, when they have not also been at the forefront or really helping the asks of building an accountability mechanism. That's something that's been needed from the very start. And yet countries aren't willing to support the creation of an accountability mechanism. There was one, UN-backed, I guess you can call it an accountability mechanism, but it was more just a documentation body by the UN called the Group of Eminent Experts on Yemen. And they were really sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. They were the one group that really was there to be able to, independent, UN-backed, et cetera, that was really documenting these violations. And they, 2 years ago, or in 2021, they were voted down. They were not, basically they had to be renewed every single year at the UN, at the Human Rights Council that takes place every year in September. And, all the countries on the Human Rights Council had to vote for their mandate to be renewed. And in 2021, a lot of civil society organizations and other organizations, our own included, went to the table hoping for something more, an actual investigative mechanism similar to the IIIM for Syria, a group that would actually come in and take this evidence that all these organizations have been building and that the Group of Eminent Experts have been building and actually use it for accountability. Because at the end of the day, you can't move forward to a full legitimate peace that's going to be lasting and sustainable unless you have accountability to begin with. Not only did countries' delegates not vote for an investigative mechanism, but they also voted to not renew the Group of Eminent Experts' mandate. And why did they do this? Because Saudi Arabia had been calling several of the countries that were on the Human Rights Council and ensuring that they would not vote for this to be renewed. And so under their pressure, several countries that previously either abstained or might have voted for the renewal now switched to voting no. And that is hugely devastating for this war and for the people of Yemen. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just devastating. And people have been living with this for 8 years, which we keep talking about. And they've gone, we keep listing off statistics, but to have to go through all of this and then also have all of these countries state that there's not even a need to be documenting what's happening there, that they don't even see the need to invest resources to have one mechanism to be on the ground and actually pulling together the evidence of what's happening is absolutely devastating. I really don't see how countries can be able to move forward without at least being able to document violations. And the fact that the UK is also then using this as part of their argument for why there's not evidence is just incredibly upsetting, considering that they have a role to play with this as well.
Well, Nico and Emily, I see time has actually flown. We've got about 3 minutes, and just some final thoughts from you, Emily, and we'll get to Nico.
I think just whatever happens in this court case is just one of the mechanisms that we're using to challenge these arms sales, and we will keep challenging them because it's the only thing to do. That, you know, we stand in solidarity with the Yemeni people, that there needs to be justice. This can't be ignored. We can't keep witnessing so many atrocities, so many deaths, and not do something. So I think this is just part of the fight to do something about it. And we just have to continue, and we have to keep highlighting what's happening. We have to keep trying to hold our governments to account and just sort of keep up the pressure so that people don't forget about the situation in Yemen, that we do keep acting in solidarity with the people there, and we keep on talking about it, and we keep trying to do something about it, because it's just not good enough not to. We have to. We don't have a choice.
Well, thank you for that, Nico. Up to you, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I hope that we get to a point where this litigation doesn't even need to happen to begin with, that countries just abide by their own laws and their own standards that they would use towards themselves and to countries that they apparently see as being their version of human and their, you know, compatriots in a way. I hope that they hold themselves to the same standards that they expect to be held to, and don't need to have organizations be pouring resources into litigating against them when it's laws that they've agreed to themselves. And I hope that they actually are able to see that Yemenis as people, that they are killing as individuals, and that there's no difference between them and Ukrainians or them and UK citizens, and that any civilian harm is too much civilian harm. Thank you for having us on tonight. I'm very grateful for this chance.
Well, to both of you, Niku Jafarnia and Emily Apple, I'd like to thank you. I believe that we have covered a lot of ground in unpacking and understanding what has been unfolding, and more importantly, this courtroom battle against the United States arms sales to Saudi Arabia, putting all of that into context and into perspective. Certainly a lot of value has been added by the presence of both of you on tonight's discussion right here on Salam Media. We wish all of you, both of you, all the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Niku Jafarnia also has this evening, Yemen and Bahrain researcher at Human Rights Watch, and Emily Apple, a media coordinator at Campaign Against the Arms Trade. And we definitely will be watching this space and watching developments as they unfold in the British courts on this particular matter. The time is just gone, 8 p.m. We're going to go for a break, and when we come back, we've got the all-important discussion looking at ESCOM, looking at SOEs and the state of South African SOEs. And the question we are raising is, are we going to become the next Zimbabwe or the next Venezuela? So stay with us, don't go away.